Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. French bond futures and the euro slip after surprise win for the nation's left-wing coalition. France is set for political instability with no party winning enough to claim a majority to govern. Biden doubles down as more House Democrats want him to step down as the party's nominee. The U.S. president has stepped up his campaigning ahead of hosting NATO leaders in D.C. Plus, reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian is elected as Iran's president. We'll discuss the impact domestically and internationally throughout the show. Well, good morning again, everybody. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates, 5 a.m. over here in the UK. I'm in London this week. Jemana Versace live from Bloomberg. Lots to talk about. Let's get you right to some of the market action that we had towards the close of the week last week. Of course, we've had a very politically heavy weekend. We're going to be talking about the outcome of that French election, bit of a surprise result for the far left. And of course, that is our main story today. Also, we'll be talking about those Iranian presidential elections as well, with the surprise reformist actually coming out on top there. But before that, a quick look at how markets have fared. The big event on Friday was that non-farm payroll print, another sign yet that the labor market has started to cool within the U.S. What we did see was an uptick in the S&P by the close on Friday. S&P up about 0.5%. Big tech dominating there. Meta and Alphabet touching new records. We did see a rally in 10-year yields after those numbers came through. And you can see this morning we're sitting at around 4.30% right now, so about 1 basis point higher over the course of the day. And then France, obviously in focus here. We saw a bit of a dip in the euro once the initial results came out last night, suggesting a big surge for the left. But of course, the big question for France from here onwards is what is going to happen to that budget, particularly in light of some of the plans that have been put forward by the far left. Whether or not they can actually implement those plans is a big question. But as you can see, the deficit has been wider than 5% of GDP since COVID times. So a lot of questions for investors moving ahead. But speaking of, let's get to the main story, and that is the fact that the left-wing coalition is on course to win the most seats in France's legislative election in a surprise blow to far-right leader Marine Le Pen. Now, a leader of one of the parties in the New Popular Front alliance says the nation's wishes must be respected.
A majority has made a different choice for the country. From now on, the will of the people must be strictly respected. From now on, no subterfuge, arrangement, or combination will be acceptable. The lessons of the vote are irrefutable. The defeat of the President of the Republic and his coalition is clearly confirmed.
And for more on this, let's bring in Bloomberg's Caroline Conan, who joins you right now live from France. Caroline, well, I mean, lots to talk about here, but I guess one of the major takeaways is that the turnout number was extremely high, but then also that seems to have supported the left and the center.
And you're exactly right. It was a huge surprise last night with the podium exactly the opposite of what we expected. The left-wing alliance getting around 180 MPs in this new National Assembly coming first. And then second, Macron's party with around 160, actually doing much better than expected. And in the third position, the National Rally, huge disappointment for the far right when just a few days ago, we were warning about a possible outright majority for Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella. Instead, they are getting only around 140 MPs in third position, very far from the majority. Clearly, the so-called Republican front with more than 200 MPs pulling out of the race in the runoff in order to block the national rally. That actually worked out. As you were mentioning, high participation also played in the game. That means a lot of left-wing and centrist voters actually voted to block the national rally. Now, the question is for the market, of course, is exactly what this means. There is no one who's got the majority. The far left within this alliance of the left has got about 75 MPs. So also very far from the majority, even though you just heard Jean-Luc Mélenchon saying he was ready to govern, ready to implement their entire program. Clearly, what comes out of this election is a hung parliament, and the likelihood is that we're going to see a wide coalition with Macron possibly extending a hand to the center-left in order to find a new prime minister.
I think absolutely key for markets here, Caroline, is that no one single party has obtained an absolute majority, which means some of those policies will probably be checked by other parties in that future coalition. Bloomberg's Caroline Conan, thank you so much for your reporting. Now let's bring in Bill Papadakis, Senior Macro Strategist at Lombard, Odier and CIA. Good morning to you, Bill. Let me just start off straight off by asking you how you think markets will react to the outcome. A bit of a surprise surge for the left.
Thank you, and nice to be with you. I think from the market perspective, there were two scenarios which would have been worrisome, and that would have been either an outright majority by the left or an outright majority by the far right. And the clear takeaway from last night's second round result is that neither of them came anywhere close to forming a majority. As a result, the riskiest scenarios have now been eliminated. Of course, that doesn't mean it's all clear. We will have a period of uncertainty and most likely dysfunctionality in French government, but we won't have any scenario of some particularly disruptive policies being implemented. And as a result, for markets, is mostly a status quo situation, taking us to a somewhat similar scenario to what we had before the snap elections were announced.
Yeah, and you raise an interesting point there. One of the terminal charts that we had on at the top of this show was just a figure, a chart showing how wide the French deficits have been. Ever since COVID, we have not seen a budget deficit less than 5%. So even though there's going to be a changeover in governance, a new coalition, hung parliament, what does that mean for the trajectory of debt, given that the status quo was already quite expansionary?
It's a good question. I think we should make no mistake here. Deficits are likely to stay pretty wide for some time. Already, it was a struggle for a government that was in place before to do some minor adjustments in fiscal policy in order to bring the deficit more into line from fairly wide territory. And now that there is no clear majority in parliament, and given how long and arduous any negotiations to form any kind of coalition that is going to govern the country are likely to be, I think it's very tough to assume as a baseline that the deficit will narrow significantly. It might narrow a bit on cyclical terms if growth improves, if interest rates come down a bit, but not as a result of government action. So I think markets will have to grapple with budget deficits in France being wider than expected for a longer period than we could have assumed earlier.
Well, market participants have been closely watching that spread, the differential between 10-year OATs and 10-year Germany. Today, we're not seeing a lot of movement. Euro slightly lower. In your view, what is the best way to express a specific view, macro view on where France is headed? Is it the currency or is it a fixed income trade?
So I think it might be a little bit early in the day to see how easily the markets have digested the results, but it's true. We're ending up in a scenario that's closer to status quo and further from any of the risk scenarios. And as a result, I think big market reactions in the aftermath are looking a little bit unlikely. In terms of how to express a market view, of course, the most straightforward instrument would be the French sovereign bond market and the spread versus Germany. But like we said before, if we end up with just gridlock, instead with a scenario that looked likely maybe a month ago of an outright majority that could have led to disruptive government policies, then in that context, I don't think we should expect a very sharp market reaction, be that in the FX market or in the sovereign bond market.
Yeah. Very fair. All right, Bill, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. Bill Papadakis, senior macro strategist at Lombard, Odier, and CIE. Thanks very much. All right, just in the last few minutes, we've got some breaking news coming in from Boeing, and this is per the U.S. Justice Department. Let me just bring you the headline. So Boeing agrees to plead guilty to fraud after violating the Department of Justice deal. And just to give you a little bit more context there, this, of course, after the Justice Department concluded that the plane maker failed to adhere to an earlier settlement stemming from 2 fatal crashes of its 737 MAX jetliner. Now, under the agreement in principle with U.S. prosecutors, Boeing faces a criminal fine of as much as $487.2 million. That is the maximum allowed by the law, though the actual amounts will be determined by a judge. But what we do know now is that Boeing have actually pled guilty. This is breaking news that came in just in the last few minutes. All right, moving on to the U.S. now. More congressional Democrats are telling their leaders that they want Joe Biden to step aside as the party's White House nominee. But the U.S. president vowed to stay in the November race in an interview with ABC.
I'm the guy that put NATO together, the future. No one thought I could expand it. I'm the guy that shut Putin down. No one thought could happen. Who's going to be able to hold NATO together like me? If the Lord Almighty came down and said, Joe, get out of the race, I'll get out of the race. The Lord Almighty's not coming down.
And for more on this, let's bring in Bloomberg's opening trade anchor, Kriti Gupta, who joins me now. Kriti, Biden sounds very defiant. He is insisting on staying in the race despite many calling for him to step down. Maybe the more pertinent question here is, how is he actually polling after the debate?
Well, significantly better than before the debate. And I think that was really the sign of success, or the bar of success for this debate or this interview in particular. This is important because when you look at the 8 swing states that we like to keep an eye on that could basically sway the U.S. election, Biden is polling higher than President Trump in only 2 of them, and those in the states of Michigan and Wisconsin, 2 states that are more blue and have been blue for a while in terms of that Democratic majority. The others, and specifically in Pennsylvania, is where you're starting to see that gap widen even more, which brings us to what happens next. This is where you start to see President Biden's campaign put him on a, quote, aggressive travel schedule to, one, point out the fact that he is actually in good shape and able to execute that travel, but also to really hit those campaign states where he's polling behind Trump to reverse some of the damage that you saw. His starting out in Pennsylvania, but of course, that is just one part of it. You also have the NATO summit this week where Biden is proven, or expected, I should say, to prove his loyalty on behalf of the United States to the NATO alliance. So I'm sure some strong comments coming from there as well.
Yeah, and something we're going to be following very closely over the next couple of months. Bloomberg's opening trade anchor, Kriti Gupta. Thank you. Also up next on Horizons, protesters rally in Israel to mark 9 months since the war in Gaza started. More on that story next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in London. Iran has elected reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian as president. The heart surgeon is expected to try to improve relations with the West and revive the 2015 nuclear deal. But he faces many challenges, including Israel's war with Hamas. So for more on this, our Middle East economy and government editor Paul Wallace joins me now from Dubai. Paul, how much of a surprise was this, the fact that the reformist candidate, the one reformist candidate, came out on top in these elections?
Ajumana, if you go back to the start of the election cycle about 6 weeks ago, I think it certainly is a surprise. And certainly when the list of 6 candidates came out that the Iranian government allowed to run for president, there was only one candidate considered a reformer, and it was Masoud Pezeshkian. And at that stage, it was there was a lot of speculation as to whether he'd been allowed on to give the election a stronger veneer of being a free and fair democratic process. But I think it certainly is a surprise that he's got through. It shows that how much wariness there is among Iranians of the clerical establishment, and it's been known for a while that dissent and unrest is very high in the country, and I think there's a lot of fatigue, and there is a sense that among Iranians that they want change.
Yeah. It certainly does appear to be the case, and the fact that turnout actually did increase incrementally from that 40% we got in round one, almost 50% in round two. But will that ultimately mean that he has the full backing of the supreme leader? I think is going to be one of the big questions. Paul, thank you very much for the report and the latest out of Iran. Now, protesters rallied in Israel on Sunday, marking 9 months since the war in Gaza started. They are calling for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to step down and for a ceasefire to bring back hostages. Elsewhere, Bloomberg understands that Hamas has dropped its objections over a ceasefire proposal to halt the Gaza conflict with Israel. Now, let's bring in our Middle East economics and government reporter, Abir Abu Hamad, who joins me from Dubai. But more importantly, Abir, you were just by the Rafah border at the end of last week, one of the very few journalists from a Western organization who has recently been into Gaza. Can you just describe to us the situation there and some of the challenges that you saw firsthand?
Good morning, Jumana. So yes, I was by the border on Thursday with the UAE's government on an initiative to show the humanitarian effort that is being put into helping the patients and helping the people of Gaza. So just at hindsight, some numbers that I have with officials that were accompanying us on that trip, the UAE has put in about $700 million into humanitarian work with Gaza since the start of the conflict. So that includes the UAE's desalination plant, UN contributions, warehouses of medicine. But Jumana, the situation is pretty dire. And, you know, some of my conversations with the officials, they were telling me that the situation has deteriorated, in fact, over the past few weeks, especially with the closure of some essential land routes that were the only path for governments to send in their aid into the Gaza Strip. So now the only way that governments, including the UAE, can sort of help add the aid into the Gaza Strip is through airdrops into the northern part of the Strip, which is not enough and not targeted enough, according to a lot of the officials that were on that trip. We spoke to a lot of patients. Some patients were evacuated on the trip back to Abu Dhabi with us. Similarly, this has been happening over the past few months. But, you know, those are people that some of them were waiting for months on a makeshift hospital by the UAE on this very vast ship by the Egyptian side. People who lost their family members, people who lost spouses, people who don't know whether they're going to be evacuated or go back or come to the UAE for treatment. So the situation continues to be incredibly dire for the Gazan people, and a ceasefire deal seems to be much needed in their perspective.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that ceasefire deal. It feels as though the mood music has changed somewhat over the weekend, with Hamas indicating that they are actually willing to accept the ceasefire proposal, but we don't have full details. What has changed?
Correct, Joanna. So according to Bloomberg sources, we understand that this could be the first sign of an actual concrete, deal in the horizon. A truce is very possible after months of fruitless negotiations between the two parties. Now, we understand that these negotiations or discussions between the two parties are going to continue into this week. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, said that there are still gaps between the two sides. But I guess one of the main things that are different about this time is that Israeli media have pointed out that Hamas is no longer insisting for a full withdrawal of Israeli troops, at least at the early stages. Now, this deal, Joanna, as you know, was suggested by President Joe Biden in May, and he suggested a three-phase sort of deal that ends in the full halt of the war. And I guess this deal now, or the possibility of this deal, brings into light the question of whether the possibility of a wider escalation in the region, including with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, comes to question, something that has brought a lot of concern for governments in the region. So deliberations continue this week, but we know that Hamas has moved over some of the sticky points earlier.
Yeah, something we will monitor closely. Abir Abu Hamad, our Middle East economics and government reporter and deputy chief head of the bureau in Dubai. Also coming up, Zimbabwe's central bank governor's seemingly impossible success on taming currency turmoil. We'll look at his first 100 days next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in London. Zimbabwe's new central bank governor, John Mushayevayanu, has completed his first 100 days in office. The veteran banker has managed to create a stable new currency known as the ZiG, as well as tame price pressures in a nation that's been plagued by hyperinflation. Joining us now from Harare is Bloomberg's Ray Ndlovu. So this new currency, the ZiG, was launched a couple of months ago. It is linked to gold. How successful has the rollout been? And is this a cause to celebrate for the governor in his first 100 days of term?
Thanks, Jumana. Well, the ZiG, as you say, it was launched about 3 months ago in April. It's been partially successful in the sense that there's been some stability on the currency front. The previous currency which was in place, the Zimbabwe dollar, had crashed some 80%. But now with the ZiG, after 3 months, it's only lost value about 1% against the dollar. But the initial rollout was also filled with a lot of challenges among those banks struggling to switch over, as well as even up to date, some citizens saying that they're not able to actually access the currency. So it's been a mixed bag for the governor in the last 100 days that he's been also in office and overseeing this currency transition.
What risks still remain to the rollout of the currency, but also to Zimbabwe's economy?
I think the biggest risk right now that's there is the drought. Zimbabwe, among other Southern African countries, are plagued by the El Nino drought. So that has implications as well in terms of inflationary pressures coming to bear on the country again. For the wider economy as well, lower commodity prices. Zimbabwe is a mineral-rich country. Lower global commodity prices are a risk because, that's where the bulk of the revenue comes from. So it's some of the things that the governor also has to look out for and a challenge going forward for him.
Yeah, well, at least things seem to be on the right track per the latest IMF comments. Thank you, Bloomberg's Ray Ndlovu from Harare, Zimbabwe. Also coming up, our next guest says Iran's new reformist president cannot bring about fundamental change, but he is someone who the West can do business with. More analysis next. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. French bond futures and the euro slip after a surprise win for the nation's left-wing coalition. France is set for political instability with no party winning enough to claim a majority to govern. Biden doubles down as more House Democrats want him to step down as the party's nominee. The U.S. president has stepped up his campaigning ahead of hosting NATO leaders in D.C. Plus, reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian is elected as Iran's president. We'll discuss the impact domestically and internationally throughout the show. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates, 5:30 a.m. over here in the UK. I'm Jumana Versace in London. Quick market check for you. You can see the S&P futures are slipping somewhat as we head into the U.S. session, down about 0.2%, coming off from a better close on Friday. Of course, we did have those NFP numbers coming in slightly lower than market expectations if you include the revisions of prior months. More signs that the U.S. labor market has begun to cool. 10-year yields are sitting at 4.29%, up about 1 basis point, though we did rally about 5 basis points on Friday. Euro in focus after the results of the second round of the French elections, showing a big surge in popularity for the left, but no absolute majority for any party. 108.30 is where we're sitting right now. And then OAT futures, because the cash market isn't yet open for trade, is around 0.2% weaker. So not a significant move yet indicated for that cash open, but of course we will be keeping a close eye. Let's take a quick look as well as the terminal chart that we're focused on today, and that is just a look back at France's deficit over the last couple of years. And as you can see, since COVID times, the budget deficit has actually been wider than 5% of GDP. The EU target 3%, so they've been overshooting for a couple of years. And again, a big question for market participants is whether or not those budget numbers can start to come in the years ahead. But let's turn to how markets in Asia are faring as well. Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio as well. Avril, what is on your radar this morning?
Yeah, Jumana, I think the main theme is how initial jitters surrounding the French election noise that were reflected in Asia stock benchmark that started the day a bit lower, clocking gains now as we go on. I think the focus is shifting towards what Jay Powell is going to say in Congress. And if he reinforces that deflationary narrative, that could be supportive of Asia currencies, including the yen, maybe some risk appetite in stocks as well. Today, the Taiwanese benchmark getting an added boost from TSMC after it got its price target upgraded by Morgan Stanley. Chinese equities are underperforming today. Maybe no surprises there given how Chinese authorities seem to be meddling a bit more in markets today, particularly some talk about the repurchase operations for the bond markets there. Jumana.
Avril, thank you so much for the overview. All right, back to our other top political story of the morning. Iran has elected reformist candidate Masoud Pezeshkian as president. The heart surgeon is expected to try to improve relations with the West and revive the 2015 nuclear deal. But he faces many challenges, including Israel's war with Hamas. Let's bring in Sina Azodi, adjunct professor of the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Good morning. Well, good late evening to you, Sina. Thanks so much for joining us on the show today. Look, let me just start off by asking you how the West should view the election of this so-called, quote-unquote, reformist president in Iran.
Well, good morning to you, and thank you for having me. I think, compared to the other candidate, Saeed Jalili, who was a hardliner member of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, I think this is really good news. Because for years, his worldview was that the West is a threat to Iran. Iran does not need improved relations with the West. And that's actually how he emphasized during his campaign, that there are many opportunities inside Iran, and we have to neutralize the sanctions. He did acknowledge the impact of sanctions, but his approach was neutralizing the sanctions, which is quite the opposite of what Dr. Pezeshkian is now arguing, that in order to improve the economy, and which was a huge issue during the campaign, we need to talk with the West. We need to lift the sanctions and even adopt the FATF or the FATF, which Iran tried in the past but didn't pass the authorities' approval.
Yeah. So one of the priorities that he's talked about is perhaps renewing or reopening discussions around the nuclear deal that was introduced in 2015. President Trump obviously famously pulled out of that deal. How closely do you think the fate of that deal and future discussions are going to be linked to what happens in November with U.S. elections?
Well, I think currently the deal only exists on paper because Iran no longer abides by the agreement. It is technically in the agreement, unlike the United States, which withdrew from it, but it doesn't abide by any of the restrictions of the JCPOA. So really the question is whether Pezeshkian and his team can convince Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, to agree to talk with the Western powers especially the United States, to somehow write a new agreement. Because as I said, that deal only exists on paper now, and reviving it, I think it's quite impossible given the so many advances that Iran has had in its nuclear program. So there has to be a new deal, from my understanding, to address the new technologies that Iran has and previously did not have. And when it comes to the elections in the United States, it's a huge a predicament for Iranians. President Trump, if he comes back to White House, there's a very good chance that he could withdraw from the agreement again and reimpose the sanctions again back on the Iranian economy, which will have a devastating effect. So really, I think at this point, even if Ayatollah Khamenei approves negotiations with the United States, they will most likely wait to see who will become the president of the United States in November.
It's certainly going to be a big question from a geopolitical standpoint. But let me just turn to the regional politics. Again, we were speaking to my colleague from Bloomberg News a short while ago, talking about the prospect for a potential ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, also the implications that would have on the southern border in Lebanon. To what extent do you think Iran has been also actively engaged in some of these ceasefire discussions simply because they have their proxies and their allies in the form of Hezbollah and Hamas? So to what extent is Iran also going to be sitting at the decision table deciding whether or not to accept a ceasefire term at this point?
I don't think neither the Americans nor the Israelis would allow Iran to be at the negotiation table. But I think something we have to keep in mind is that the relationship that Iran has with Hamas is completely different from the relationship that it has with Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a Shia group. It's much closer to Iran than Hamas, which is a Sunni group. And Iran has had its own issues with Hamas in the past, including most recently the fact that Hamas did not tell Iranians that they're going to attack, and Iranians were in a very difficult situation. I think the role that Iran will play is to make sure that it does not get dragged into a conflict with Hezbollah, with the United States and Israel. I think that there's asking, either privately, potentially probably from the Hezbollah, not to escalate the conflict. In the meantime, publicly, they have declared that they will use all means necessary, which is, getting into a conflict with the Israelis over Hezbollah. But I think at the end of the day, Iran will not risking a war with Israel, which means, by extension, a war with the United States over Hezbollah.
How do you see the developments in southern Lebanon, northern Israel? A lot of strong rhetoric on both sides indicating, that they're willing to take it one step further away from the daily crossfire and exchange of fire that has taken place since October 7th. How likely is it, in your view, that the situation in southern Lebanon actually does escalate into a full-blown war?
I think there's a lot of brinksmanship and a lot of, as you said, rhetoric going on. Iranians are, issuing their own threats. Hezbollah is issuing their own threats. Israelis are issuing their own threats. So are the Americans. But I think at the end of the day, we have to keep in mind that nobody would be interested in escalating the conflict. And I think with the ceasefire, the ceasefire proposal that is happening between Hamas and Israel, I think that could also help with reducing the tensions. We have to keep in mind that we are in an election season in the United States, and I don't think that any president in the U.S. would want another conflict in the region. And as I pointed out, I don't think Iranians are interested in fighting Israelis directly, and the United States by extension, over Hezbollah. So I think while there's a lot of brinksmanship, while there might be skirmishes over the border, but I don't think that we will see a full-scale war between Hezbollah and the Israelis.
All right, we'll leave it there. Sina Azodi, thank you so much for your views this morning. Really interesting perspectives on the Iranian elections and beyond. Now, let's return to that breaking news we saw at the top of the hour. Boeing will plead guilty to criminal conspiracy after the Justice Department concluded the plane maker failed to stick to a settlement from 2 fatal crashes of its 737 MAX jetliner. Benedict Kamel, who leads our global aviation coverage, joins us now. Benny, first of all, what do we know about the terms of this deal, and also how much of a surprise or blow will it be for Boeing?
Good morning. So it's not a huge surprise. We knew this was in the works. The Department of Justice had told Boeing that they had essentially not complied with the previous agreement. So this was going to happen. The sort of details of this new agreement, those came out a short while ago. And it actually doesn't look that terrible for Boeing. There'd been a huge range of what was on the table. The families of the crash victims involved in these 2 crashes, that's essentially what it's about. One crash at the end of 2018, one in 2019. The families are demanded a huge sum of money to penalize Boeing, something to the tune of $25 billion. It's much, much lower than that. It's about $450 million thereabouts, and they will actually get credit for some money they've already paid. So the money, you could say, is almost negligible. They will also have to install a corporate monitor for a couple of years, about 3 years. They have to spend additional money on improving their compliance. So financially, this is all doable for Boeing. The next step now really is, what will the families say? Will they agree to this? Will they not agree to it? They've quickly already put out a statement saying they think this is another sweetheart deal, one that sort of lets Boeing off the hook. So the question really is, will the judge overseeing this, will he agree to it? And will he hear the families? And what are the next steps in that regard?
Bloomberg's Benedict Kamel, thank you very much for the report. Also coming up on Horizons, demand for commercial properties in the UAE is not losing any steam, sidestepping a global slump. We have more on what is driving the surge next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in London today. All right, let's turn to commercial real estate and the boom in the UAE. Both Dubai and Abu Dhabi are experiencing a surge in occupancy rates as businesses flock to the region, which is in stark contrast to slumping demand from around the world. Dubai, for example, is planning to build 3 new office towers in the heart of its financial district, while Abu Dhabi is working to expand its free zone by including neighboring Al Reem Island. Joining us now is Taimur Khan, the head of research at CBRE. Great to have you with us this morning. Let me start off by asking you how you see the outlook for commercial real estate in both Dubai and Abu Dhabi over the next year.
Hi, good morning, Jumana. Our view is that it's actually still quite strong, despite the fact that we feel that activity is slightly hampered by the fact that we're experiencing very, very high occupancy levels, whether you look into Dubai or you look into Abu Dhabi. And the problem behind that is a lack of supply. And as you say, because of this, right now what we're seeing is actually some of this supply being fast-tracked and brought to market a lot quicker than originally had been the plan.
Well, my colleagues on the BN side, Zainab Fatah, has written a report about how offices within Al Marih Island in Abu Dhabi are full. The government is now looking to expand into neighboring Al Reem Island. Is there a risk that they are perhaps expanding or over-expanding too quickly? Is the demand going to be commensurate with the new supply that's coming?
I think so. I think, first of all, the level of demand is pretty unprecedented at this moment in time, and that's been a significant driver. But I think, whilst Al Reem and the jurisdictional move into Al Reem will play a significant part, it's not like that we expect the all of Al Reem Island and the land bank available there to be offices. It'll be in parts. It'll be a mixed-use development. So I think the government is being, smart about this, and they are looking to actually match supply and demand. And I think that's where the real estate market cycles here have changed very, very significantly. Rather than supply being the lead, what we're seeing now is actually, it is much more of a, phased approach, which incorporates demand very heavily into future calculations.
Taimur, where is that demand coming from? What does it look like in practice?
I think it's very, very broad. We always talk about the financial centers, and we talk about the fact that demand is originating from the likes of the hedge funds, the financial institutions, some of the sort of global critical banks that we have. But the reality is, if you look outside of the main financial free zone, if you look at other free zones and even onshore jurisdictions, we're seeing a lot of firms actually expanding their headcount very significantly to service the UAE, to service the wider region. So that includes a lot of tech, and that is particularly centered in parts in Abu Dhabi as well. But we're also seeing a lot of the move towards in-country value growth as well. So manufacturing firms, and not high-end manufacturing, but nonetheless manufacturing firms starting to trickle into the economy here as well.
I think people around the world will probably be surprised to hear that commercial real estate is doing so well in Abu Dhabi and Dubai, given that it is a weak spot for so many metropolitan cities around the world, especially since COVID, the change in working conditions, the move towards a hybrid, flexible working model, in addition to the higher interest rate environment. All of these are structural reasons for commercial real estate not doing well in other parts of the world. Why is the UAE immune to those forces?
I think we're just at a different cycle at the moment, and I think given the relative where the stock is, the quality of the stock here that we have, and how it incentivizes and drives people to come in and actually come into the office and be with their colleagues. I think on the whole, in many sort of global cities, we are seeing that commercial real estate is on a headline level not performing well. But when you delve into those numbers, the really interesting thing is your LEED Gold, your LEED Platinum buildings are not only achieving much higher levels of occupancy, but the rents that they're achieving are a lot higher than the wider market. So I think what this goes to show is the quality of the real estate is driving occupancy, and I think that's true here, and I think that's true in a number of other key cities, global financial centers, and gateway cities around the world.
Yeah, so interesting. Well, Taimur, thank you so much for joining me. That would typically be my studio, but today I'm out of London. Thank you, Taimur Khan, the head of research at CBRE, joining us from our Dubai studio. And if you want to read more about commercial real estate, you can sign up for our Mideast Money newsletter on Bloomberg.com. This week's edition is all about the real estate market and more. But our weekly newsletter covers the intersection of wealth and power in the region and how its sovereign investors and deal makers are transforming global finance. Also coming up on our show, 4 international companies are reportedly eyeing a stake in an Adnoc LNG plant. The details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in London. Well, Bloomberg sources say 4 international companies have agreed to invest in Adnoc's next liquefied natural gas LNG export project. We're told Shell, Total and BP will each take a 10% stake in the Ruwais LNG plant. This is expected to raise the UAE's LNG export capacity to 15.4 million tons per year. So for more on this, Bloomberg's Middle East energy markets reporter Anthony DePaula joins me now. So what is the status of the Ruwais LNG project, and what is Adnoc's strategy in bringing in those partners that I just spoke about, Anthony?
Yeah, good morning, Jumana. Well, the project is still on the drawing board. They are going ahead with it. They've awarded $5.5 billion worth of construction and engineering contracts. So Adnoc has decided to go ahead with that project, and we're waiting to see some more specifics on when that's going to be online, kind of middle of the second half of this decade, probably. And bringing in those partners will kind of shore up that capital structure and the business there. It's similar to a kind of partnership that Adnoc has in a lot of its oil fields and its gas-producing fields as well, where Adnoc keeps 60% of the deposit and farms the rest out to partners. That allows them to bring in some expertise in some drilling, in some new ways to tap new wells. It brings in that expertise, and it also gives some of those international oil companies access to some equity crude or equity gas. We're still waiting to see what the commercial structure is going to be like for this Ruwais LNG project. At the moment, it's with Adnoc, the main company. That's later going to be shifted to Adnoc Gas, which is Adnoc's listed gas distribution company, according to the plans that we understand. So we will see how that structure in terms of the marketing works out. But basically, this is part of Adnoc's push to increase its gas business, both domestically in terms of production and specifically with Ruwais LNG, that export capability to tap into those other growing markets around the world, Jumana.
Yeah, and just quickly, what is Adnoc doing to build up its gas and LNG trading business?
Well, the country has a goal of being self-sufficient in gas by 2030. That means that they will be producing more gas and selling more gas. They have some imports from Qatar that come down via pipeline, and they're building up these gas fields to export more, and they want to really expand an international trading business. So we've seen them get into LNG businesses in the United States, in Mozambique, buy into a gas field in Azerbaijan, and they are looking for more globally. We also reported last week that they're looking at some assets of Santos in Australia. So they really are looking to get a global footprint of LNG and allow that to build up a trading company as well, because they see that as a market where there's going to be future demand going forward, and they want to tap into that, Jumana.
Yeah. Anthony, thank you so much for your reporting. Anthony DePaula, Bloomberg's Middle East Energy Markets reporter. Thank you for that. Well, a quick look at some of the key markets as we head into Daybreak Europe. Of course, the top story over there is the results of the French elections, the surge of the left, and what that means in terms of how the next legislative government, parliament, is going to look like in the coming years. You can see the euro has dropped slightly, OAT futures as well. Cash markets don't open up for a couple of hours. But that was Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Bersachi in London. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.